Hey guys, I'm Gideon Epstein, and this is SRPC Econ. What is SRPC, you may ask? Short Run Phillips Curve. Now, we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the production possibilities frontier. So, this is basically showing the various combinations that a firm could produce at a certain time. Okay, so let's get right to it. So, here we've got Absolut Vodka and Grey Goose Vodka. And we're showing right here on this point, right here, this point, that's an efficient allocation of resources. If you produce out here, that's not possible. It's not possible to produce out there. And if you produce inside, you're not using all your resources. So those are the basics. All right, so now that you know the basics, we're going to talk about opportunity cost. Basically, all that is what you forego when you take an opportunity. So currently, we're producing at 5 units of Grey Goose vodka and 0 units of Absolut vodka. If we wanted to increase production of Absolut vodka to 2 units, then the units of Grey Goose vodka that we were able to produce would change to 3 because that's where they meet up on the original curve. Okay? And that means that our opportunity cost is 2 because 5 minus 3 is 2. All right, you got it? Great. We've got 2 new firms. We've got Firm A and Firm B, and they're still producing the same good. This is Absolut vodka, and this is Grey Goose, Absolut, Grey Goose. Okay? So I'm going to explain the concept of absolute advantage, which is just when so these two firms have the exact same amount of resources, but absolute advantage just means that you can produce more. Really simple, you can just produce more with the same amount of resources. As you can see, Firm A has the absolute advantage in Absolut vodka because they can produce 5 when they can only produce 2 units of Grey Goose, and Firm B has the absolute advantage in Grey Goose vodka because they can only produce 2 units of Absolut and 5 units of Grey Goose. Alright, so now we're going to talk about comparative advantage, and all that means is that you can produce at a lower opportunity cost. Firm A can produce 5 units of Absolut vodka while producing 0 units of Grey Goose. Or they can produce 2 units of Grey Goose while producing 0 units of Absolut vodka. Okay, so here 5 would go in your denominator. And if you wanted to decrease that to 0, you'd have you'd be able to produce 2 units of Grey Goose. And this leaves you with an opportunity cost of 0.4. Okay, now we can look over here, and we can see that either Firm B can produce 5 units of Grey Goose while producing 0 units of Absolut vodka, or 2 units of Absolut vodka while producing 0 units of Grey Goose. So it's going to be the exact opposite of the other fraction. So it should be 5 units of Grey Goose. And if they decrease production of Grey Goose to 0, they can increase production of Absolut to 2. So this will be 2.5. So as you can see, Firm B has a higher opportunity cost. So because Firm A has an opportunity cost of 0.4, which is lower than 2.5, that means that they have a comparative advantage, a lower opportunity cost of producing Absolut vodka. Hey guys, I'm Gideon Epstein, and this is SRPC Econ. Alright, today we're going to be talking about one of the most basic concepts in all of micro, which also carries into macro. A simple supply and demand graph. So let's get right into it. Alright, so we know on the x-axis, or the horizontal axis of the graph, we have a Q, which symbolizes quantity. And on the y-axis, or the vertical axis, we have P, which is price. Then we have our D, which is downward sloping, because consumers experience diminishing marginal utility. Our supply curve is upward sloping. We'll label that as S. And right here, where the supply and demand meet, is where we have equilibrium. Okay, so as you can see, I've finished up drawing the graph. So what I've added in is a supply curve, which is upward sloping, a demand curve, which is downward sloping, and the equilibrium price and quantity. Okay, now we're going to talk about the law of supply and the law of demand. They're both very simple. The law of supply says that an increase in price will decrease the quantity supplied. What the law of demand says is that an increase in price will decrease the quantity demanded. Okay, so now let's talk about 2 acronyms for shifts in supply and shifts in demand. So first, let's talk about ROTN, an acronym for shift in supply. So R stands for resource costs, O stands for other goods and prices, the first T stands for taxes and subsidies, the second T is for technology, or a change in technology. E stands for expectations. And finally, N stands for number of suppliers. Those are all the things that could shift the supply curve. And we're moving back over to the beautiful graph, and we're just going to show you a quick shift in supply. This shift right here shows a rightward shift of supply or an increase in supply. And this shift will increase the quantity and decrease price. Q2, and we'll shift that to the right. And this will shift downward. So the quantity increases and the price decreases. And this could occur, for instance, because of a shift in technology or a change in taxes and subsidies. We know that rotten was a shift in supply, tribe is a shift in demand. And here's what they stand for. T stands for tastes and preferences, R stands for related goods prices, and related goods can include substitutes or complements. I stands for income, and B stands for buyer numbers, and E stands for expectations of the consumers. Okay, now let's look at a shift in demand, and we'll use our acronym TRIBE. The first term in TRIBE, T, stands for tastes and preferences. Say that people find out that bananas cure cancer. That would cause an increase in demand. An increase in demand will cause an increase in quantity, as well as an increase in price. There you go. There's our market for bananas shifted with the demand curve up.
Rastafarianism! Right now, we're going to be looking at the aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. Alright, so up top here we have the US economy. Now let's label our graphs. At the x-axis, we have real GDP. Now at the y-axis, we have price level, which just shows how high or how low prices are in the economy. With curves, downward sloping aggregate demand curve, which is just represents the demand for goods and services in the economy, and the short run aggregate supply curve, which is the measure of the supply of goods and services in the economy. And finally, we have the long run aggregate supply curve. The long run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line because it shows that no matter what the price level, real GDP remains the same. All right, now let's go over the concept of sticky wages, which can help us explain the difference between SRAS and LRAS. Sticky wages is just the concept that when price level goes up in the short run, wages don't change. So that means the cost to a firm of producing stays the same even when prices go up. That means that they can produce more even if prices go up. So that's why it's upward sloping. In the long run, wages are not sticky. So that means the cost of producing also rises with the rise in price level. So they can't produce any more output than they were producing. Now let's look at shifts in the aggregate demand curve. All right, this can result from many different fiscal policy actions, which we will go over later. Let's say aggregate demand is shifted to the right. In the new aggregate demand curve, it intersects SRAS at this point right here. Now we can see when it's shifted up, output is higher and price level is higher. This shows an inflationary gap. Price level is higher, so it's an increase in inflation. And that is shown right here. Okay? Now, let's say AD is shifted left. Now, when AD is shifted left, it intersects SRAS at this point, right here. So the new real GDP output is going to be right here, and price level right here. Price level has gone down, and real GDP has also gone down. This shows a recessionary gap because real GDP is lower than the long run full employment output GDP. Okay? And that's shown right here. Now we're going to look at the self-correcting mechanism. Let me erase this real quick and we can start off with a new graph. Probably the worst possible scenario for the US economy is a thing called stagflation. It is when SRAS shifts to the left. Now this is an awful scenario for the US economy because at this point right here, real GDP has gone down and price level has gone up. The price level has gone up. So inflation and recessionary gap in real GDP. Worst scenario. Now let's look at how the curve corrects itself. Okay? With the increase in price level and decrease in output, suppliers can't pay their workers as much, so wages drop down. Now, when wages drop down, suppliers don't have to pay their workers as much, so it costs less to produce. So that means that SRAS will shift back, supply will shift back to the right, back to equilibrium. Okay, so we've looked at supply. Now let's look at demand. This is the most typical type of recession that the US economy faces. When aggregate demand shifts left. Now, we can see that output has decreased and price level has decreased. Output is low, price level is also low. So, when output is lower, that means it's less revenue for the suppliers, so they can't afford to pay their workers as much. So that means wages go right down. And now that it's a lower cost for suppliers, their supply can shift right because they can produce more. And we see right here, we're back at equilibrium. Quantity, we're back at equilibrium quantity of real GDP output. But you can see, when we move over to the y-axis, right here, price level is lower than it was at equilibrium. Basically got the concept of ASAD. Now, you're going to look at fiscal policy.
Sup guys, my name's Shashank, this is MCMB Economics. Today, we're talking about fiscal policy. Alright, so to understand fiscal policy, we need to break down aggregate demand into its components. C plus I plus G plus NX. Here is consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. So, the government can increase spending, which will increase this G value, or it can decrease taxes, which will increase the amount of money consumers can spend. And what this will do is it will increase aggregate demand. And when aggregate demand increases, you can see that there is a shift to the right. That is how the government can manipulate the economy to stimulate a higher GDP. Now, what happens when the government decides that it's going to decrease spending or that it's going to increase taxes? Well, consumer spending will go down because there's more taxes, they don't have any money. G will go down because they're decreasing spending, and that can shift aggregate demand down here to the left. Alright, so we have seen how government spending or government taxes affect the aggregate demand curve. Now we're going to see exactly how that happens. That is through the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. So I'm going to introduce you to a couple of terms, and that is MPC and MPS. MPC stands for marginal propensity to consume, and MPS stands for marginal propensity to save. What this equation means is for every dollar that a consumer has, they can either spend it or they can save it. Now, we can see the effect of increased spending by the government on the spending multiplier. Let's say the government puts $400 into the economy. So immediately that will increase the economy by $400. And then the recipient of that money can either spend it or save it. And depending on how much he saves, we multiply that initial value by 1 divided by how much he saves on the dollar to find out the total increase in aggregate demand in the economy. Similarly, the government can manipulate taxes, and when the government manipulates taxes, it changes the amount that consumers have to consume, and so we can calculate how much of an effect the taxes have on the aggregate demand curve. And the reason for this negative sign is because a decrease in taxes increases aggregate demand, and an increase of taxes decreases aggregate demand. So it's an inverse relationship right here. I want to introduce you to another interesting thing, which is that the tax multiplier is smaller than the spending multiplier. So, on many AP tests, they will ask you if the government increases spending and increases taxes, what effect will that have on the aggregate demand curve? And the answer to that is it will increase the aggregate demand curve, despite the fact that they will affect each other inversely, because spending is always bigger than taxes. So, I want to do an example with you. So here's my example, just to make sure that you guys understand what I'm trying to say. Alright, so suppose that we have an economy with a marginal propensity to consume is 0.6%. Now suppose the government increases spending by $400. Now, we know that our formula for the spending multiplier is this multiplied by 1 over MPS. And we know that MPS plus MPC is equal to 1. So MPS is equal to 1 minus 0.6. Alright? So now we have 400 multiplied by 1 over 0.4. Now, if we do that calculation, it comes out to $1,000 right here. So what we can see is that an increase in government spending by just 400 has increased aggregate demand by $1,000 in total. Hi, it's your boy Shashank. This is MCMB Economics. Alright, so when we talk about monetary policy, which is our lesson for today, we're going to need a completely new graph, which is of the money market. Okay, over here we have the nominal interest rate and the quantity of money. And now I'm going to draw in our money demand curve. And now I'm going to draw in our money supply curve. And this is interesting. So our money supply curve is perfectly inelastic. And the reason is because in economics we assume that the Federal Reserve has complete control over the supply of money. And now we're going to talk about why that is. So these are the ways that the Federal Reserve can influence the money supply through monetary policy. The first one is open market operations, which is buying and selling bonds. And remember, guys, buy shifts the money supply to the right, sell shifts the money supply to the left. Because think about the L in sell and think left, and that's how you remember that. Because you're thinking about the flow of money. When you're buying a bond, you're pushing the money into the economy. Over here, you have the reserve requirement. And that's how much money banks have to keep as reserves. And if this is very high, then that means banks have to keep a ton of money in them and they can't lend it out, which means that if this goes up, the money supply goes down. And over here, the final thing they can do is manipulate the interest rates. And the way they do this is they manipulate this thing called the discount rate. The discount rate is the rate that banks have to pay the Federal Reserve to loan from the Federal Reserve. So if it's hard for banks to loan from the Federal Reserve because the discount rate is high, then they won't, which means the money supply will not be high, it will go down. And now let's see what shifts in the money supply graph look like. Let's say that the Federal Reserve decides that they are going to buy bonds. This is going to shift the money supply to the right. All right? And we have MS1. Now, what's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is the interest rates are going to go down and the quantity of money is going to go up. And the opposite is true for if they decided to sell bonds. That would shift the money supply left, and the interest rates would go up, and the quantity of money would go down. Let's talk about expansionary and contractionary monetary policy. So, expansionary monetary policy is increasing the money supply, which will stimulate the economy, because when there's more money, that means the nominal interest rate will go down, which means that people will spend more money, and that will stimulate aggregate demand. And now, decreasing the money supply is called contractionary monetary policy, and that shifts AD to the left on your ASAD model. And so that's important to know. Thank you. This has been MC equals MB Economics.